My parents tried to force me to take in my troubled brother, but I chose my family instead. I'm a 35-year-old guy married with 2 kids. One's 8, and the other is 5. Life is already hectic with a full-time job and 2 young kids running around the house. So when my phone buzzed late one night, I had a bad feeling right away. I saw it was my parents calling and knew it wasn't going to be good news. It wasn't the usual, just checking in kind of call. My mom's voice was shaky, and after a few seconds of awkward small talk, she got straight to the point. My younger brother, Chad, who's 28 by the way, was in trouble again. He had lost his job, was deep in debt, and was about to be evicted from his apartment. My mom said he had nowhere to go and asked if he could stay with us for a while. My heart sank. I'd heard this story too many times before. My brother has always been a bit of a disaster. Growing up, he was the kid who could never stay out of trouble, always getting into fights, hanging out with the wrong crowd, and generally just making things difficult for everyone. As an adult, it didn't get much better. He's been in and out of jobs, mostly because of his own bad decisions. And when he wasn't losing jobs, he was losing money, gambling, drinking, or who knows what else. I've lost count of how many times he's borrowed money from me and never paid it back. So, when my parents asked if he could stay with us, it wasn't exactly a surprise. But it wasn't something I wanted to deal with either. I already had my hands full with my own family. My wife and I both work full-time jobs, and between the bills, the mortgage, daycare for our youngest, and extracurriculars for the oldest, we're stretched thin. Not just financially but mentally and emotionally too. I didn't respond to my mom's request right away. I just listened as she went on about how bad things were for my brother and how he didn't have anyone else to turn to. Then she pulled out the big guns: family responsibility. She reminded me that family is supposed to help each other and that my brother just needs a little support. Right now I knew what she was doing. My parents have always been good at the emotional guilt trip, especially when it comes to my brother. No matter how many times he screws up, they always find a way to make it seem like it's my responsibility to help him get back on his feet. While my mom was talking, I couldn't help but think about how much time and energy it takes just to keep my own family afloat. My kids are at that age where they need constant attention. My wife and I are always juggling playdates, school events, and work projects. The thought of adding my brother, with all his baggage, into that chaos seemed like a recipe for disaster. And I knew my wife would feel the same way. She's been through this with me before. A few years ago, my brother stayed with us for a couple of weeks, and it was a nightmare. He didn't pay rent, left messes everywhere, and even borrowed some things that mysteriously disappeared when he moved out. We barely got through that situation without it blowing up our marriage. As expected, my wife wasn't on board when I told her about the call. She didn't even hesitate. "Absolutely not," she said, and I couldn't blame her. She's seen how my brother operates. He comes in, makes a mess of everything, and then leaves us to clean it up, both literally and figuratively. I went back to the phone, and my mom wasn't happy with my hesitation. She started to push harder, saying they couldn't handle him anymore and that it was our turn to step up. Then she hit me with the final blow: my dad's health. Apparently, the stress of dealing with my brother was making things worse for him, and they didn't know how much longer they could manage on their own. That one hurt. My dad has had health issues for a while now, and hearing that this situation might be making things worse put me in a tough spot. I felt like I was being backed into a corner. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. My brother was never going to change, and bringing him into my home would only make things worse for my family. After I hung up the phone, I sat in the dark for a while, trying to process everything. I could hear my kids snoring softly down the hall, and I knew that whatever decision I made, it would impact them too. I didn't want to let my parents down, but I couldn't ignore the fact that my first responsibility was to my wife and kids. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see my brother's face, hear my parents' pleading voices, and feel the weight of the decision I had to make. I knew I couldn't keep putting it off, but I also knew that whatever I decided, someone was going to get hurt. It felt like no matter what I chose, it was going to be a disaster waiting to happen. The next morning, I decided I couldn't avoid my brother any longer. My parents had already made it clear they expected me to step up, but I wanted to hear it straight from him. Maybe he'd surprise me. Maybe this time he'd own up to his mistakes and show some responsibility. So I called him. He answered after a few rings, sounding groggy like he'd just woken up, even though it was almost noon. I didn't beat around the bush. I asked him what was going on, why he'd lost his job, and how things had gotten so bad that he was about to be evicted. His response wasn't surprising but still managed to irritate me. He brushed it off, saying his boss had it out for him and that the landlord was being unreasonable. According to him, none of it was his fault. He said he'd been unlucky with the job, and the eviction was because his landlord was a jerk, not because he hadn't paid rent for months. He went on about how everyone's always against him, how things just never go his way. I asked him what his plan was. He paused for a moment, then said, "Well, I guess I'll come stay with you for a bit until I get back on my feet," just like that, like it was already a done deal. No apology, no asking if it was okay, just an assumption that I'd take him in because, in his mind, that's what family does. It was clear he hadn't changed. He still wasn't taking any responsibility for his situation, still blaming everyone else for his problems, and still thinking it was someone else's job to clean up his mess. I told him I'd have to talk it over with my wife before making any decisions, which he didn't seem to take seriously. He just said, yeah, okay, whatever. Let me know when I can move in. When I told my wife about the call, she was even more against the idea than before. She didn't hesitate. Absolutely not, she said, and I couldn't blame her. She reminded me of the last time my brother stayed with us and how it had nearly destroyed our peace at home. He doesn't care about anyone but himself. You know that, she said firmly. And we can't let him drag us down with him again. While I was still trying to figure out what to do, my parents called again. This time, they weren't as gentle. They said they couldn't handle him anymore and that it was our turn to step up. Then they hit me with the final blow, my dad's health. They said the stress of dealing with my brother was making things worse for him, and they didn't know how much longer they could manage on their own. That one hurt. My dad has had health issues for a while now, and hearing that this situation might be making things worse put me in a tough spot. I felt like I was being backed into a corner, but at the same time, I couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. My brother was never going to change, and bringing him into my home would only make things worse for my family. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. The weight of the decision felt like it was crushing me. On one hand, I didn't want to abandon my parents or leave them to deal with my brother alone. On the other hand, I couldn't sacrifice my own family's well-being to save someone who didn't even want to help himself. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with the weight of the decision. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured my parents' disappointed faces, my wife's frustrated voice, and my brother's smug assumption that he could waltz in and disrupt our lives. I knew whatever decision I made, someone would end up hurt or angry. Felt like an impossible choice. The next day, I resolved to stand firm. I called my parents and told them I couldn't take my brother in. I explained how it would affect my family, especially my wife and kids, and reminded them of how things had gone the last time he stayed with us. My mom didn't take it well. You're just abandoning him? She said, her voice rising. He's your brother. Family is supposed to help each other. I tried to reason with her. Mom, I've helped him before, but it's never enough. He doesn't change and it just ends up hurting everyone else. I have to think about my kids. My dad chimed in, his tone more resigned than angry. We're not asking you to take him forever, just until he gets back on his feet. I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. How many times have we said that before? And when has he ever actually gotten back on his feet? You're just kicking the can down the road. The conversation didn't go anywhere. My parents accused me of being selfish, of putting myself above family, and hung up on me. Stung. But I knew I had made the right call. A couple of days later, things escalated. My brother decided to take matters into his own hands and showed up at my house unannounced. He had his bags with him and acted like it was already decided that he'd be staying. Hey, he said casually, like we'd invited him. Where should I put my stuff? My wife's face turned red with anger. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice trembling. I've got nowhere else to go, he said. Looking between us like this was the most obvious thing in the world. Your family. Where else am I supposed to go? I stood frozen for a moment, caught off guard by his audacity. My wife wasn't having it. You can't just show up here without warning and expect to move in, she said firmly. We haven't agreed to anything. Well, what choice do I have? He snapped. Mom and Dad said you'd help me out. That's when I finally found my voice. No, they hoped I'd help you out, but I never agreed to this. You can't stay here. He stared at me like I just slapped him. Are you serious right now? I'm your brother. And I'm a husband and a father, I shot back. My first responsibility is to my wife and kids. The argument got heated. My brother accused me of turning my back on family, of being heartless, and even of being under my wife's control. My wife, to her credit, stayed calm but firm, reminding him of how much we had already sacrificed for him in the past, and how he had taken advantage of our kindness every single time. In the end, we didn't let him in. He stood on the porch, fuming, as I handed him the number for a local shelter and a list of job postings I'd printed out earlier, just in case. He threw the papers on the ground and stormed off, muttering under his breath. The fallout was immediate. My parents called that evening, furious that we hadn't taken my brother in. They accused us of being cold-hearted and said they were ashamed of how we were treating him. My mom cried, saying she couldn't believe we'd abandoned him in his time of need. For the first time, I didn't let the guilt consume me. I stood firm. He's not my responsibility, I told them. I've done everything I can for him, and it's never enough. He needs to figure this out for himself. In the days that followed, my brother continued to play the victim, posting on social media about how his family had turned their backs on him. Some relatives reached out to scold me, while others quietly offered their support, saying they understood the impossible position I was in. My wife and I leaned on each other through the storm, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were truly a team. It wasn't easy, but we stood our ground, and slowly, the chaos began to fade. Now, a few weeks later, things are finally starting to feel normal again. My brother is staying with a friend for now, though I've heard through the grapevine that things are already starting to go south. My parents are still upset with me, but I'm starting to accept that their disappointment isn't my burden to bear. My wife and I are closer than ever, and our kids seem happier and more at ease. For the first time in a long time, our home feels like a safe, peaceful place. And I've learned an important lesson. Sometimes, protecting your family means making the hard choices, even if it means standing up to the people who raised you.